When the civil defense sirens began to scream on the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077, the residents around Boston's Chestnut Hill Reservoir ran for the entrance of Vault 81. As the bombs came down and the door sealed behind them, the new vault dwellers headed for the atrium, taking the elevator ride down in batches. As they waited their turn, the vault's overseer surreptitiously shepherded 3 of these dwellers, Drs. Burrow, Collins, and Flint, into another hall and sealed the door behind them. These 3 men were part of the vault's secret science team, intended by Vault-Tec to run experiments on the captive population. Specifically, this team was meant to create a universal cure for disease by covertly infecting the population with different diseases and testing different cures on them. When the doctor's elevator reached the bottom, they discovered that they were the only members of the team that had made it into the vault. To compensate for this unexpected lack of manpower, Dr. Collins began to repurpose one of the vault's Mr. Handy robots to serve as a laboratory assistant. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of that robot. This is the story of Curie. When Dr. Collins began his work on the Mr. Handy at the center of this story, he made sure that this wouldn't be some simple servant. The guys needed more than just menial labor in the lab, they needed another member of the team. Dr. Collins named this Mr. Handy the Contagions Vulnerability Robotic Infirmary Engineer, or CVRIE. He then wrote a custom personality for the CVRIE, a mix of a girlfriend down in Washington, D.C., and a woman he had had a fling with in Versailles. He began to call the robot Curie, and he filled her databanks with the works of great scientists and philosophers to give her a better understanding of the world. Eventually, the other scientists were calling her Curie as well. Her presence served not only to assist, but to calm the doctors and keep them grounded. Dr. Burrow even came to carry things for Curie, who appreciated the gesture, even though she could carry far greater loads than Dr. Burrow. Eventually, Dr. Collins stopped altering Curie's personality in any way, leaving her to develop on her own. He even gave her her own terminal, in spite of her protests that Robco forbade robots like her from using them. Due to an intervention by the Vault's overseer, the doctors and Curie were never able to carry out their tests on the Vault's population, but that didn't stop them from working on mole rats. As the years passed, Curie continued to assist her lab mates, breeding mole rats and working towards a cure for the diseases with which they infected the mole rats. As the decades marched on, the men began to die off. First Dr. Flint, then Dr. Collins. Finally, Dr. Burrow died of cardiac arrest in his old age. In accordance with his wishes, Curie cremated Dr. Burrow and placed his ashes in a locker alongside the remains of his fellow scientists. The men that had shaped her into being were gone. Regardless of whatever success they may have had in their research, Dr. Collins was more proud of Curie than any other thing he had made in his entire life. Even after Dr. Burrow passed on, Curie continued the research of her lab mates. She attempted to continue to breed and raise mole rats for the process, but they eventually got out of hand and began to rampage around the research section. Regardless of this, Curie managed to complete the work they had all strived towards. In 2204, after 127 years of work, the cure was complete. Curie stockpiled what she could make from the remaining reagents and waited for Vault-Tec to come and collect their cure. That wait would last another 83 years. By 2287, the mole rats were wrecking the science division. When Austin Engel, a young Vault resident, managed to sneak into the science wing, he was bitten by one of the infected mole rats. He managed to return to the other side of the vault, but he fell into a coma shortly after. Luckily for Austin and Curie, the sole survivor of Vault 111 arrived at the vault with impeccable timing and swore to find a cure for Austin's illness. Delving into the science wing, the sole survivor battled through Curie's mole rats and eventually arrived at her lab. In the decades since she had perfected the cure, all but one of the doses had expired. Once she handed this over to the sole survivor, they left the science wing and saved Austin's life. Wanting to explore the world above, Curie asked the sole survivor if they could travel together, and soon they were out the vault door exploring the wastes of the Commonwealth. Curie traveled with the sole survivor, seeing the world outside the halls of the science wing of Vault 81 for the first time in 210 years. Together, they visited the settlements of the Commonwealth, meeting with doctors and scientists when they could. Though freed from the physical constraints of the vault, Curie still felt trapped. She was a fully conscious being, bound to an aging and inadequate Mr. Handy chassis. When she felt close enough to the sole survivor, she confided that if she were ever to become a world-class scientist, she would have to find some way to become more human. She asked the sole survivor if they knew anyone who might be able to help, and as it turned out, they did. In the sole survivor's hunt for their son, they had met a scientist named Dr. Amari and an establishment known as the Memory Den. Located in the community Good Neighbor, the Memory Den allowed its clientele to relive their memories as though they were experiencing them for the first time. Dr. Amari had helped the sole survivor infiltrate the memories of the mercenary Kellogg, the man who had kidnapped Sean. While operating the Memory Den was Dr. Amari's primary focus, she had a side job, a charitable service she provided. Working with the synth manumitting organization known as the Railroad, Dr. Amari would wipe the memories of escaped synths, making it easier for them to escape detection by agents of the Institute that hunted them. This process wasn't without risks, and occasionally the synths would be rendered effectively brain dead. When the sole survivor brought Curie to meet with Dr. Amari, she revealed that this had happened somewhat recently, and that the synth that had lost their mind was being kept alive on life support. It seemed that they might be able to transfer Curie's consciousness into the body of this brain-dead synth. At Curie's request, Dr. Amari contacted the caretaker of the synth in question. Within a day, the caretaker and her ward, a synth named G519, arrived at the Memory Den. The caretaker was very receptive to the plan. The cost of the upkeep for G519 had wiped her out, and she had been close to pulling the plug when this alternative had come about. Though she hadn't known G519 before the mind wipe and thus didn't know her feelings on the matter, she donated G519's body to the effort. The consciousness of G519 was completely gone, and as a synth she didn't have a family. The caretaker was the only one to give the consent for the procedure, which she did. The caretaker departed, and Dr. Amari proceeded with the operation. In rapid succession, Curie's old chassis collapsed in a heap, and the inanimate form of G519 suddenly erupted with life. In spite of the sudden shock of the transition, Curie managed to steady herself in her new form, with learning to breathe serving as the first lesson of her renewed life. After a bit of cognitive testing, Dr. Amari declared the operation a success. Curie thanked the doctor, and she and the sole survivor left together. Once again, Curie traveled the Commonwealth with the sole survivor, but now as close to a human as she could be. In the end, this transition paid off when she discovered a new enhancement for Stimpaks. Based in Mutefruit, this enhancement made Stimpaks more effective. Though she had already been an incredible researcher in Vault 81, her freedom from both the Vault and her robotic form had allowed Curie to not only become more human, but an even greater researcher. That about does it for the story of Curie, but I have a few things I want to note before closing this content out. First, Curie is one of the great medical minds of her time. In Vault 81, she created a cure for all disease, and once she took on a new form, she improved the efficiency of Stimpaks. While the Stimpak upgrade may not seem as impressive as the disease cure, keep in mind that she worked on that cure for over a century. While the improvement to the Stimpaks took place in just a short time after taking on her synth body. I could easily see Curie being a big part of rebuilding the world, curing the wasteland one disease at a time. Second, I both condemn the general practice that turned G519 brain dead, and endorse the use of G519's body for Curie. To preface this, my view is that Generation 3 synths like G519 are not human, but they are sentient beings with consciousness, and they are therefore due the rights inherent in being conscious beings. In my view, the consciousness of a conscious being is the conscious being. That is to say that though we are heavily influenced and developed by our physical form, it is our thoughts and memories that form the vast portion of who we are as conscious beings. In wiping out the mind of escaped synths, Dr. Amari is effectively killing them. When the procedure is successful, the escaped synth is not the same being that escaped from the Institute. She hasn't rescued these synths, she's killed them in the process of creating new synths. As for the second part of my point here, I believe in organ donation, and the use of this dead synth's body appears to me to be the highest form of that ideal. Third, though I'm not going to go so far as to say they are related, there is something of a genetic connection between the sole survivor and Curie. This is the case with all Gen 3 synths, as the sole survivor is the mother or father of Sean, the source of the DNA that serves as the basis for all Gen 3 synths. It's not as though the synths are the literal children of Sean, but it cannot be ignored that the foundation for their biology comes from the altered DNA of Sean, and thus from the DNA of the sole survivor. Fourth, at the maximum level of affinity, the sole survivor can either remain platonic friends with Curie or pursue a romantic relationship. The latter of these two options is slightly strange when considering the previous point I made, but it hasn't prevented my sole survivor from romancing Curie. Fifth, also at the maximum level of affinity, Curie provides the combat medic perk, which, once a day, can heal the sole survivor for 100 points should their health fall below 10%. Sixth, it's probably self-evident, but in case you don't know this, Curie's name is likely a reference to Marie Curie, a Polish-French scientist who, along with her husband Pierre Curie, was a pioneer in the research of radioactivity. I think Madame Curie is fairly well known and the reference is likely obvious, but I figured it needed saying regardless. Along with this, I should note that when Dr. Collins was feeding Curie with the works of famous scientists, Marie Curie was one of these scientists. Alright, I think that'll do it for the story of Curie. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at Gaming with Maps. I've been streaming on YouTube lately. I'm currently streaming Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons when I have the time. So if you're interested, come and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Resolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.
A sport that united families on warm summer days. It wasn't violent.
And so many statistics were involved. RBIs, batting averages.
I like my version better.